And welcome to a special edition of AIPAD Talks, where we are thrilled to present to you an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour of Discovering Ansel Adams with Ansel Adams scholar and Center for Creative Photography Chief Curator Dr. Rebecca Senf joining me here today at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. I'm Michael Hulett of the Hulett Collection Gallery in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm a member of the AIPAD Education Committee. AIPAD is dedicated to creating and maintaining high standards in the practice of exhibiting and selling photographic art, and encourages public support of fine art photography through communication and education. We hope you'll join us this spring in New York for the photography show presented by AIPAD, taking place April 22nd through 26th at the Park Avenue Armory. We'll see you there.
My name is Becky Senf, and as Michael Hulett said, I work at the Center for Creative Photography as their Chief Curator, and I've been researching Ansel Adams since about 2003. So I have a long history of working on Ansel Adams and thinking about him and his process, his evolution. And this exhibition is really focused on following that evolution from his very earliest photographs through to the famous signature works that we know. And so I want to start by looking at some of these early photographs that he made. I'd like to look at this photograph, which is called Forest in Yosemite Valley, which Adams made around 1920. And he had actually made photographs before that. He had a box Brownie camera and made snapshots when he went to Yosemite as a 14-year-old in 1916 with his family. But this photograph demonstrates how far, first of all, he's come in just about 4 years. So he's gone from making amateur snapshots to making these beautifully composed, incredibly thought through, technically proficient photographs. But what's interesting to me about Forest in Yosemite Valley is, for me, thinking about this evolution and where he starts and where he ends up, we look at a picture like this, and I want you to think about a photograph like Aspen's Northern New Mexico, like the horizontal version from 1958, where it's a big print, it's very contrasty, there's all this drama, you have a really clear sense of light. And then think about how different this photograph is. It's very intimate, it's very small. Your proximity to the subject of the trees and this meadow is very immediate. You're not back from it, but you're right up close. And you're really in the scene. You're embedded in this forest. You don't see all the tops of the trees. You don't see the whole scene. It's very low in contrast. It's in the middle range of the photographic print spectrum. And so it's different in style, it's different in content, it's different in treatment. And so my question to myself as I was doing my research is, how does Ansel Adams get from a picture like this to a picture like Aspen's Northern New Mexico? And how can we follow that progress? So from here, I'd like to go look at some of the Parmelian prints and think about that next step in his progress. In the late 1920s, Ansel Adams had an opportunity to create his first commercial portfolio. So up to that point, he'd been making photographs of the mountains and in the Sierra Nevada, where he was a frequent hiker. And he had this opportunity to create a portfolio for sale. Albert Bender, who was a San Francisco Bay Area arts patron, offered to help connect Ansel Adams to other patrons to pre-sell a portfolio of photographs. Ansel Adams was really excited at this prospect, and with this opportunity gathered together photographs he'd already made in the High Sierra, and then additionally made some new photographs that were of a similar kind to include in this portfolio, which he called Parmelian Prints of the High Sierras. And I'm sure folks know that Parmelian Prints is a made-up name. It's a fictional word, but it was intended to help people understand these photographic prints as some kind of artwork, a print that you might purchase. And the feeling was that maybe photographs didn't convey that. So Adams makes this portfolio of 18 photographs. And what's important to me about them is thinking about how they record Adams's experience in the wilderness. In many ways, they represent different points in a hike or an extended camping trip, and they show mountain peaks, they show meadows, they show places that to me really read as campsites or the place that you might stop at the end of a long day of hiking. This is one of a few exceptions in the portfolio. This is actually on the floor of Yosemite Valley. It's a picture of El Capitan, but most of the photographs are up in the higher reaches and show places like this is Roaring River Falls. And to me, it's a very synesthetic photograph. I can, when I look at this photograph, imagine Adams standing there over the water. I can imagine how it sounds. I can imagine that if you're standing there hiking in bare legs, that the splashing water is bouncing up and hitting your legs, and you can feel those cold droplets after a long hike. There's a real quality of experiential landscape to me in this photograph and in other ones from the Parmelian prints. And I'll point now to Monolith Face of Half Dome, which is the most famous of the photographs from the Parmelian prints. And here we're seeing the photograph that Adams described as his first visualization. So this happened in 1927, that he hikes to a place in Yosemite Valley called the Diving Board, where you are way up near the rim of Yosemite Valley. And he turns towards Half Dome to make a photograph. And he first makes one exposure, and then he thinks about the impact he wants the final photograph to have. And as he considers the impact, the ethos, the awesomeness of this experience, he realizes that he hasn't made a negative that's going to allow him to create the print he wants to make. So he changes to a different filter, he makes another exposure and produces this photograph, which to me is the first example of him using the kind of printing technique and use of light that comes to characterize his mature work. We've included in the exhibition 2 prints of it. So on the right-hand side is the Parmelian print, which is on the translucent paper that was what he used for that particular portfolio. And on the left is a print on a regular Baryta-coated gelatin silver photographic paper. And it's an opportunity to see how these different materials result in a different kind of look. The print on the left is less warm, it's a glossy surface, it shows more detail and and less texture than the Parmelian print. But it's nice to see them both and to think about the way that those different materials impact the outcome of the final print. Now, the Parmelian print portfolio, although Adams had the support of Albert Bender, was not financially very successful. He wasn't actually able to sell them out. And so you still see Parmelian prints available for sale. They're not particularly expensive, but they're a really good example of Ansel Adams starting early in his career. So throughout the 1930s, Ansel Adams continues to make photographs that are more like that 1920 photograph that we started with than they are like his mature works that we'll see in just a minute. And these photographs are some great examples of what this work looks like. So he's still photographing in Yosemite Valley. He is, in this case, this is the valley view in Yosemite Valley, where you're looking from the esplanade towards the east. So you're seeing Bridal Veil Falls, El Capitan. In the distance, you're seeing Half Dome. And this is the scene that Ansel Adams photographs over and over again. And we can see him playing with light and weather effects. He's exploring what you can see and how you can make a photograph, how you can use clouds and light and fog and darkness and light to create different kinds of photographic effects. But he hasn't yet hit upon the kind of dramatic and awe-inspiring photograph that he'll come to. But one of the things that I like about this photograph on the left is that if you look very closely, we can see across the bottom of the frame, right at the bottom edge of the picture, we actually see the wall that describes the edge of the parking lot where people stand to make photographs of the valley view. And if you look very closely, right in the middle is actually the National Park Service didactic that's explaining the view that you're looking at. And I think it's really interesting to see Ansel Adams including those elements of the built environment in the photograph and acknowledging that it's not just a wilderness scene. In fact, it's not a wilderness scene at all. He's in a national park that has roads and all kinds of amenities. And so he's just acknowledging and kind of pointing to that in this photograph. So throughout the 30s, he's making really exquisite photographs. He is becoming technically a very accomplished printer. He's making prints that are very subtle, very sensitive. He's capturing qualities of light as they reflect off of whether it's leaves or the edges of a pond or sparkling off of snow. He's becoming very adept at making photographic prints that convey what he's seeing and bringing it through to this art form. And that practice of making these really beautiful prints comes to serve him very well as we move into the next phase and look at what he accomplishes in the 1940s. So something really important happens to Ansel Adams in 1941 that I think creates a shift in his thinking about how to make photographs, and it allows him to catalyze all of the experiences that he's been having. And I probably should have mentioned earlier, one of the things that I have found in doing research on Ansel Adams, and particularly studying these early years, is that one of the ways that he gets from that early forest picture that we saw to a picture like Aspen's northern New Mexico is that he's really thinking about how to use his experiences. He learns from his failures, he learns from his successes. He's accumulating all of this different life experience, photographic practice, thoughts about the audience, and they're adding together to allow him to move his practice forward. And so we see a big jump that happens in the 1940s. In 1941, he gets contacted by the Department of Interior in Washington, D.C., and asked if he would be interested in making a photographic mural to go into the new Department of Interior building. And they mentioned that they have photographic murals that are painted, but they're interested in the prospect of having one that's photographic. Now, Ansel Adams loves this idea. I have to imagine that this was exactly the kind of invitation he'd been waiting for. And when it comes, he realizes that this is an incredible opportunity. And so he actually upsells the Department of Interior, the federal government, and persuades them that they don't want him to make just one photographic mural, but really they should hire him to photograph the national parks and all the things that the Department of Interior oversees, which includes the Indian reservations and public works like dams. And so he goes off on an extended trip through the American West, photographing the national parks, with this intention of creating these photographic murals to decorate the Department of Interior building. And the view that we're looking at here of the Grand Canyon is one of the photographs that Ansel Adams imagined could be a centerpiece of a suite of murals about the national parks. And he particularly liked a photograph like this that's very abstract and has this all over pattern for a large mural-sized photographic print. What we're looking at here is not one of the ones that he made for the Department of Interior, because what happens is in December of 1941, the United States enters World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And because of that, Adams's funding for the photographic project isn't renewed, and the photographic murals at that time are not made for the Department of Interior building. But of course, Adams had made these photographs in the national parks, and it had really changed the way he was approaching his photography. And I think that this commission is so important because for Adams, it allows him to think about making photographs for a particular audience, and that audience is the American public. It is legislators, it is lobbyists, it's the people who are visiting the Department of Interior building, and he knows what message he wants to convey. He's interested in sharing with this broad national audience his investment and connection to the national parks and to wilderness and natural spaces more generally. And he loves the idea of getting to make them on this massive scale. And so all of these elements of thinking about how to make a photograph that's going to convey this impact pushes him towards this new language, this approach to photography that's going to convey this message and importantly get this idea across through a photographic image. And I have another example that I'd like to show you that will really demonstrate these qualities. I think that this photograph is a great example to talk about the characteristics of Ansel Adams's signature style or his mature style. So one of the things that we see in these national parks pictures, and then we basically see them in all of his photographs going forward, are four primary things. One is this panoramic sweep of landscape. So unlike that forest picture we started with, we're now pulled way back. We have a sense of the whole scene. We feel like we're able to take in everything that is in front of us. Another thing is the use of light and weather effects to create a sense of drama. It also creates a sense of ephemerality. So we have a sense that this scene wasn't like this 5 minutes before. It may not look like this 5 minutes later. So we're seeing it at the moment where there's all of this heightened tension and drama that's being conveyed by the movement of the clouds, the breaking through of the light, the way that the light is reflecting on the surface of the river. We also have an omniscient point of view. So this means that there's a sense that we're seeing this scene from the very best, the most perfect, perhaps the only place that this scene could possibly be photographed. And that gives a quality that this is the epitome of how to see this particular scene. And then finally, he's using a zone system way of printing. So we've got everything from bright white highlights to deep dark shadows and a balance of the various grays in between so that it has a kind of contrast, a snappiness. There's still lots of detail. There's subtlety in the shadow areas. There's subtlety in the highlight areas. So we have a kind of photographic look that's very different from that subtle, little, low contrast photograph that we began with. And all of these techniques, all of these characteristics were leveraged by Adams to create a sense that we're seeing something really spectacular, really meaningful, that these wilderness landscapes have the potential to change us, that immersed in the beauty and the awe and the grandeur of the landscape, we can be moved to a space outside ourselves and connect with something larger. And that was very much Adams's intention, to help people understand the potential of being in natural spaces and to give them a sense of the pleasure that was available. And it's in the photograph, but it's an advocacy for connecting with these natural spaces personally and directly as well. While Ansel Adams was on his first major road trip for the National Parks project that he does for the federal government, he makes one of his very most famous photographs, and that's Moonrise Hernandez, New Mexico, which he makes in November of 1941. And this photograph is obviously one of the most iconic photographs in the history of 20th century American photography, and it captures all of those signature style elements that we've been talking about, but it also comes with a great story. And so the story is that Ansel Adams was on this trip with his son, Michael Adams, and his friend Cedric Wright. They were doing this whole massive road trip together, and they'd been photographing in the Chama Valley near where Georgia O'Keeffe lived and had had a pretty unsuccessful day of photography. And they were driving back, and Ansel Adams suddenly swerves the car off the road into the ditch on the side of the road and starts yelling at his son and Cedric Wright to pull everything out of the car, that he needs to set up his 8x10-inch view camera, and they don't have much time because the sun is setting. So they're pulling everything out. And of course, this is a big view camera. So you've got to have a tripod and the camera body and the lens board and the lens and the film holder, and you've got to focus it. And in the hustle to pull everything out, they can't find the light meter. And so Ansel Adams realizes he's running out of time. He has to figure something out, and he's able to remember the luminance of the moon is 250 square foot candles. And he uses that to approximate an exposure time for the negative. And he sets up and makes the exposure, and he pulls the slide out, flips it over, puts it back in the camera to make a second backup negative. And by the time he has, it's too late. The sun has set, the light is off the graveyard, and either he's got it or he doesn't. And of course, we know he does have it because we're looking at the photograph that he was able to produce. And so with this photograph, he's able to capture the sense of how small people are in the expanse of the universe. And we see it represented here by this big, dark, black sky. And this photograph is one that he printed most often. We don't know exactly how many photographs he made. He didn't keep a record of every print, but the estimate is somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 copies of this photograph in different sizes. And the way that Adams tells the story, the way I just told it, suggests that it was all good luck, perfect timing, that Ansel Adams happened to just see this scene and pull over and capture it. But what I want to point out is the photograph that we have here on this side, which shows the chapel at Hernandez that Ansel Adams photographed in 1937. So Moonrise is made in 1941, but in 1937, Ansel Adams is on a trip with Georgia O'Keeffe, and they go from her home west across New Mexico and Arizona. And in the Ansel Adams archive, we have all kinds of proofs that Ansel made of this chapel, Hernandez Chapel. He walked all the way around the chapel. He photographed it from every angle, and he made this one fine print of the facade of the chapel. And this all happens in 1937. And so what's interesting to think about is that Ansel Adams was driving along. He sees the sun setting. He's imagining the photograph, the possibility, and he knows, because he photographed the chapel at Hernandez, that if he can get far enough down the road to where the town of Hernandez is, he'll have something he can put in the foreground of this photograph. So even though when he remembers it many years later and tells the story, it has all this happenstance and accident, perhaps he remembered that he could get to the town of Hernandez and create this photograph out of the elements of the landscape to produce this really iconic photograph. One of the elements that we've included in this exhibition are elements or materials from the Ansel Adams archive in casework throughout the exhibition that help gives the audience more access to the behind the scenes, the materials that I used for my research. And so what we're seeing in this case are all materials related to the Moonrise print. On the far end, we're seeing the negative, and we actually have it set up with a doorbell button so that you can see it lit from behind like that. And this is a facsimile negative. The negative itself is very light sensitive, so we don't allow it to travel, but this gives people a sense of what the negative looks like. Next to that is the proof print. And the proof print shows what that negative looks like when you basically just print it in contact. And you can see how underwhelming it is as an image. There's not the kind of dark sky, there's not the contrast. You don't really see the town of Hernandez. It blends into the landscape below. So I find that this is really helpful for conveying how much work goes on in the darkroom, and how when Ansel Adams saw this scene and made this photograph, he wasn't seeing what he eventually printed. All of that was in his imagination. He knew he could make a photograph from the negative that would eventually have that dark sky and the glittering graveyard, but that he had to accomplish with printing techniques. And on the lower corner of the case, we actually see Adams's printing notes. So this is his own documentation for himself about the steps that he goes through when he makes the print. And so each one of those rectangles represents a step, or maybe two steps in the printing process. And it indicates where he's dodging and where he's burning. So we see a -4 with all these swirly shapes in the middle over the graveyard where he's holding back the light as he's creating the print, or a +2 or a +10 where he's burning in an element of the photograph. And then each of those steps, when he reproduces them in the darkroom, creates a print. And then above that, we have a photograph that actually shows Ansel Adams and Cedric Wright and Michael Adams, his son, who at that point would have been 8 years old, preparing for this long trip where he makes the national parks photographs as well as moonrise. And it shows all the gear and them getting ready for this extended trip. And I feel like this photograph with all this material gives a sense of what that experience of being on the road must have been like. So Ansel Adams creates the signature style, and it is so incredibly effective at connecting audiences to the kind of drama and hopefulness and experience of nature that he's trying to achieve, that he is able to connect with audiences and really have a degree of success that has lasted into the present. And so we're looking at here one of these Aspens, Northern New Mexico photographs that I referenced at the beginning as the comparison to that little tiny, very low contrast, very intimate, very sweet, very beautifully printed photograph, but something that might have been easy for a person to overlook. Whereas this photograph, with its sense of beauty, again, we have this synesthetic quality where you can almost hear the leaves fluttering. You can feel what it might feel like to be standing there and looking at the scene yourself. And it really gets across the intention and the emotional appeal that Ansel Adams intended his photographs to have. And so it is with this success, and we even see it. The great thing about Ansel Adams, and this is a great pleasure of being a researcher of Ansel Adams, is that he was such a prolific writer, lots and lots of letter writing, especially, that I feel like if he thought a thing, and you're persistent enough, you'll find where he wrote it down. And so one of the things I was able to find was a letter to Beaumont Newhall, where he talks about wanting to make photographs that appeal to the many and that resonate with the many, rather than making photographs that appeal to a few or just to the people who are already aesthetically aware. And so this was very much his goal, to make photographs that many people would understand, that they would love, that they were moved by. And so it's really fun to see him so successful. And of course, we know that he made lots of photographic prints, but he also appreciated that most people would not see his work as a fine art photograph. So he was very thoughtful and intentional about the way his works were reproduced. He worked to improve photographic printing processes, reproductive printing processes for books, so that the reproductions of his work would really convey the qualities of the original photographic prints. He made postcards and posters and really wanted his work to connect with a broader audience. And so it's really exciting to be able to do an exhibition of his work here in Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, and make this work available and bring people along to this evolution of Ansel Adams from the time that he was just a young man starting out to the famous photographer that we all know.
Thank you for that amazing tour, Rebecca. Now, I have some questions I'd like to ask you after walking the show. Number one being, I think everybody knows Ansel for his black and white photographs. What a lot of people don't realize, and what you virtually never get to see, are the images that he printed in color, made in color and printed in color. And we have some of those on view here at the exhibition. Can you tell me more about his choice to photograph in color?
Ansel Adams made a fair number of photographs in color over the course of his lifetime, and his real struggle with color was that he couldn't control the printing the same way that he could in printing in black and white. And so he didn't prefer working in color because for him, the photographic process required that you have control over it in order to make the final print that you wanted. And so I think color was very frustrating. But he did make color, and actually there's a publication of Ansel Adams's photography in color if you're interested in diving deeper on this particular issue. But we have a handful of color photographic prints in the Ansel Adams archive. The prints are primarily not made by him. In fact, none of the color prints are made by him, and they're in a range of different processes. So there are chromogenic prints, there are dye transfer prints, there are sebrochrome prints, and there are, of course, are also photomechanical versions of his color work as well. But very often he's making color for commercial purposes, which is in part why they tend not to be included in exhibitions of his work, because they really are more about either magazine commissions. He worked for Kodak. He did, for a long time, there was a giant transparency, big panoramic transparency in Grand Central Station that was advertising Kodak Company. And so Ansel Adams made some of those. They were called the coloromas. And so Ansel Adams made some of those in a commercial capacity for Kodak. And he really did all kinds of commercial jobs, and a number of them included color work. So I think it's nice to see some examples. In this case, we've included color and black and white of the same subject. So these are all photographs in Monument Valley in northern Arizona. And it gives you a chance to think about how the scene looks different in color and black and white. But I think it is interesting to see him working in color, because it was quite a usual thing for him, even though we don't typically see the prints. What we're looking at here are some photographs made by Ansel Adams that are reproduced in Arizona Highways. Arizona Highways was a tourism magazine that featured views of Arizona. And Ansel Adams worked with Arizona Highways a number of times. It was a way for him to get paid to do photographic work in Arizona that he wanted to do otherwise. And so this particular piece was about the mission south of Tucson called Sanavir del Bac. And Ansel Adams has the cover photograph there in color, and you see the whole white mission settled into its landscape. And then which is there. And then inside you see a spread of a close-up of the facade of the mission building. And we don't think of Ansel Adams doing this kind of magazine work, but it was really an important part of putting together a whole livelihood in photography. At this time, there weren't lots of opportunities for photographers. So if you wanted to work as a photographer, you had to hustle and you had to find the jobs that were out there. And one of the great things about Arizona Highways is that he could do an extended story. The pieces were often written by his colleague, Nancy Newhall, and that allowed him to explore and to find funding for opportunities that allows him to make photographs that then will become his fine art prints.
In your opinion, what is the most revealing object included in this exhibition and why?
I'm so excited that you asked about most revealing object, because it allows me to show off more of the archival objects that are in the exhibition, which I think are really revealing because they allow us to see behind the scenes, they allow us to see who he is. And for me, these are the materials that help me understand his evolution and understand all the aspects of his personality that inform the photographs. So I'd like to show some of these pictures in the case that relate to his time as a young man, as a mountaineer. And so we talked earlier about the Parmelian prints of the High Sierras. And in his late teens and 20s, Ansel Adams did lots of mountaineering. He went out both with the Sierra Club and with various hiking mentors and friends, and he learned all the aspects that you needed to know to be a good mountaineer. So he was learning things like reading maps and navigation. He was learning how to cook in the outdoors. He was learning about the flora and the fauna. He was learning astronomy and geology so that he could understand the terrain and the landscape that he was looking at. And what we're seeing here is actually a picture from one of the Sierra Club outings, the summer outings. That's Ansel Adams all the way on one side, sort of slumped over, goofing around with other friends from the Sierra Club. And these pictures to me help me appreciate how important these experiences of being out in the wilderness, of being on extended trips, of being immersed in the experience of sleeping, under the stars and being in the weather and figuring out how to move through that terrain. It was really important. It helped create both his character and a connection to the wilderness that's what persists through all of his work. And it's that intimate connection to the wilderness that makes him create pictures like all of the mature photographs that we see that are about how important this place is to him and that he wants that experience for other people. And so understanding how formative these mountaineering opportunities were really changed the way I understood his photographs and his intention behind the photographs that we see. We also have some letters in the case. These are from the 1920s, and I realize they're hard to see on the screen, but it gives us a chance to hear his voice, to see what was important to him in these early moments, to hear him describe these experiences out in the wilderness, but also to see things like his handwriting and to watch his handwriting change from year to year. It helps remind me that he's a young person who's in evolution and is trying to find his adult self. And we can literally watch that happen as we see his handwriting change.
Can you tell us some more about Ansel's work with the marketing department in Yosemite and how his work there evolved his aesthetic over time?
Michael, thanks for that question. I'm really happy to talk about his work for the marketing department for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company because I actually think this might be my biggest contribution to Ansel Adams's career in terms of my research. I spent a lot of time looking at the way he worked for Yosemite Park and Curry Company, and you mentioned that it was for the marketing department. So Ansel Adams spent about 8 years reporting to someone in the marketing department to produce photographic images of the activities that happen in Yosemite Park that were controlled by the concession. The concession is like the company that provides things like the lodging and the restaurants and the commissary and they were responsible for the stables. So if you rented a horse, you spent money with the concession, or if you went golfing, you rented your clubs from the concession. So their goal was to market Yosemite year round. And in particular, they wanted to market Yosemite in the winter because they were trying to attract more winter visitors so that they could earn money year round. And so Ansel Adams was hired to make photographs that could be used for promotional brochures that could be given to newspapers to promote great seasons of snow for skiing or great seasons of waterfalls because there'd been lots of rain in the spring. And so, or they were used in, he made postcards, he made menu covers for the Ahwahnee dining room. And so Ansel Adams was photographing all around the park. He was photographing the lodging itself so that the Yosemite Park and Curry Company had materials they could use for promotion. The reason that this is so important is that he's reporting to the marketing department. These marketers understand how to create images that will persuade someone who's looking at it. So Ansel Adams is going from making photographs of the landscape that reflect his experience hiking and backpacking to now talking with someone who's trying to explain how he can make an image that will cause a potential tourist to decide that Yosemite is the place they want to take their summer vacation. And this switch in thinking about what photographs do from being a documentation or a representation of something to having the potential to persuade someone to behave differently was a really important shift in thinking. And in particular, the notion that the way you make that photograph more persuasive is to make it emotional, to really convey the awesomeness or the grandeur or the drama of a situation. And I think that lesson that Adams learns repeatedly over 8 years of working for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company is exactly what clicks into place when he gets hired by the Department of Interior to make photographs of the national parks for the American people. Because now Adams has this experience and practice making photographs that are meant to change someone's mind. And he brings that and melds it with his own interest in making photographs that persuade people about the value of the wilderness in his mature work.
Thank you so much for your time, Rebecca. And I promise this is the last question. I think a lot of photography enthusiasts know Adams' work in terms of his signature black and white images that he created. But what they may not know is how he used different techniques over the course of his career and reprinted these images. In your opinion, why do you think he would revisit these negatives and print them again time after time?
Thank you. And thanks so much for this opportunity to talk to the AIPAD audience. I'm really pleased that we were able to do this. So this is a great question. And one of Ansel Adams's famous sayings was that he thought of the negative like the composer's score and the print like the performance. Ansel Adams was a piano player. And so these musical analogies made a lot of sense to him. But I think it's useful to think of it that way. So he creates the negative at one moment in time, but if he prints that negative 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, he believes that that gives him another opportunity to interpret the negative the way that makes sense to him at that particular moment. So it sort of breaks up this idea that the vintage print is the only important print. And rather that each time he interprets it, it gives him an opportunity to make a photographic artwork that's appropriate for that particular moment, for the mood that he's in, for that time of his life, for the way that he's thinking about the subject. So Lone Pine is one that he printed over the course of his lifetime. And we can see that every photographic print is a handmade object. It's dodged and burned and printed and enlarged in a particular way at that moment. It's like baking a cake. It's almost impossible to get them exactly alike. And so here we have really dramatic shadows on the mountains, a very dark swath of the foreground hills. They've gone really, really dark. And then just that very subtle bit of light at the bottom that's focusing on the horse grazing in the pasture. Michael, you pointed out to me, and I'm so glad you did, that in some of these prints, you actually see an LP in white stones that's on that dark hillside, stands for Lone Pine, where this photograph was made. And in some instances, like with this print, he actually retouches out that LP so that it's not visible. He's basically erasing the man-made component of this photograph. And in this particular print, he's also cropped the sky pretty substantially. So we're getting a more panoramic shape to this photograph than we see in other examples. But I think this notion that Adams felt free to continue to print, to continue to interpret. Moonrise is another example. It starts with a much lighter sky and goes to that deep dark black over time. So it's all part of the artistic process for Adams and the goal of making the right print at that moment. I sure hope that everybody's enjoyed the tour and enjoyed seeing the show here at the Oklahoma City Museum of Art. I'm really glad that you came along, and I hope that you have a deeper understanding of Ansel Adams, having had the chance to see these prints and these archival objects. Thanks so much.